Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting autumn florals. These are not specific flowers, I just pretty much made them up as I made random brush strokes and decided to combine them into flower tutorial with autumn themed colors. Like usual, I'm going to start by sketching out the shapes. The shapes itself are actually very basic, but the trick to this is more about the execution with a brush and paint later. For this first flower, I'm just doing the basic flower shape. I'm not really thinking about any amount of petals within the flower. I just draw a few long petals while leaving the middle white, so I have space in between to paint the stamens. And like usual, you can also angle these slightly to give a slight form to the flowers. If you want them to slightly face the side, I mentioned in a lot of my floral tutorials about drawing ovals and finding the center, then filling in the rest. Or you can also draw the petals longer on one side, and where the petals are foreshortened, they would be much smaller. The next three flowers are basically filler flowers. The first one is very similar to the main flower but smaller and it has shorter petals. Here I'm drawing them mostly from the side, which is much easier to paint, but as I paint later I also decided to add some of the stamens peeking through, so the method is basically the same as the main flower. For this next one, I decided to do something a bit more dainty and soft, and I'm going to just draw at tiny circles, or as I paint them, I'm just going to paint random dots with the tip of my brush, and I'm going to form them into tight clusters and continue with very tiny fine stems, joining them into one main stem. You can always go back to painting the dots to fill in certain places if you feel like some places would need a bit more filling to even it out. As for the last filler flower, this is the only real one that I know of. I'm going to draw one main stem that is a bit crooked with small budding flowers. I'm not sure what these are called, but my mom always gets these flowers near Chinese New Year. They're very woody, and inside of the buds, once the outer layer dries out, you can easily pinch it off, revealing the fluffy insides. For these specific ones, I want to include the dark brown colors though, so I'll be painting the version with the buds only. I'm going to keep the colors very simple for this one. I'm going to stick with four colors, which are burnt sienna, sepia, permanent yellow deep, and terra verde. All of these are by Holbein, but if you don't have Holbein, you can use whatever color is similar to these. For this painting, I'm going to be using a lot of dry brush technique because I like the texture that it gives. The load of your brush determines how wet your painting is going to be, and as obvious as that sounds, it's not too easy to control if you're not used to it, which is why I would recommend for you to try it out on scrap paper first. To use a dry brush means to have a very light load on your brush, so when you put down the paint on paper, it will leave out small gaps of where the bristles are separated from each other, creating the dry brush texture. This also varies depending on how dry your brush is. The drier it is, the more white space you're going to have, and the wetter it is, the more color is going to travel through your bristles. So this is something that you'll be able to control as you paint. Another thing that I find useful is putting down more pressure to separate the bristles and quickly pulling it in the direction that you want to paint. This compared to painting slowly using the tip, which will be able to create a flat wash with. You can try a few of these on scrap paper first and try to just flick your brush quickly and putting a bit more pressure before jumping into the painting. If not, this painting is also doable using a wetter load, so it's really up to you, but I really enjoy the dry brush texture for this one. This technique is especially very useful when it comes to painting fine stems because the flow of the paint will be very slow. This is also something that I've mentioned in one of my older tutorials on how I paint stems, and I'll link that in the description box if you haven't seen it yet. It is possible to control the consistency with dry brush. You can use from very light consistency to very thick consistency, but to keep this simple, I'm just going to work mostly with medium to thick consistency. Let me go over each flower quickly before putting it all together so you can practice separately before tackling your final painting if you need to. For the first flower, I want the main color to be burnt sienna, but I always like to mix in a bit of the other colors, as you guys know, to create a similar tone within the painting, which is why I added a little bit of permanent yellow deep as well as the tiniest bit of sepia. For this, I'm going to use the dry brush technique in order to create the texture, and you can first start by painting a flower that's straight on because it is the easiest to visualize when the length of the petals are the same. Repeat this as many times as you would like, and then try to paint the flowers from different angles using either the oval technique or by just shortening parts of the closer petals. For the stamens, I like to make sepia the dominant color so it stands out against the brown colored flower. And to paint this, I just added dots and very thin lines using the dry brush so the lines can become very, very fine. Lastly, for the stems and leaves, I used Terra Verde as my main dominant color, mixed with whatever brown I had left on my palette. And again, I'm going to use a fairly dry brush for this to paint the stems. For the stems of these flowers, I like to make them a little bit thicker because the flowers are going to be larger compared to the filler flowers. Then for the leaves, I just painted a basic leaf shape or an eye shape, making sure that the connection between the leaves and the stem is very thin to keep it delicate. Moving on to the first filler flower, for this I want the main color to be permanent yellow deep, and I added a tiny bit of burnt sienna. For this, I'm going to paint it the same way as I did with the main flowers, but I'm going to add a little bit more load to my brush so it's not as dry as the main flower. You can paint all of them facing the side or play with the placement like I did. As for the stamens, you can either use sepia or burnt sienna as the main color. Then for the stems, I like to make the stems very fine by making sure the load of my brush is very dry for this, and I also made the leaves much smaller on these flowers. And I forgot to mention that I just used the same colors as the larger flowers, but you can just play with the ratio if you want to make it a little bit different. So here I didn't do it intentionally, but I had a bit more Terra Verde because it's a bit more green, whereas the first one was a little bit more brown. For the next filler flower, I want to create a grayish yellow-green, so I used a mixture of permanent yellow deep, Terra Verde, and sepia. And for this, I only want a very thin consistency, so I added a lot of water. And I would recommend to swatch this before putting it down on your final painting because it is quite hard to tell a very thin consistency from the palette. And then I'm just going to paint dots. It is easier to paint the dots in a lighter brush load, but for this, because it is a very light consistency, it's not too necessary, and you can always take the excess off with tissue as long as the paint is not too puddling wet. As for the stem, I want the dominant color to be sepia, but again, I just added a bit of the other colors that I had on my palette also. For this and the other stems, I always want a very dry brush load to help with the fine stems, especially the ones connected to the flowers. Whenever you have too much paint on your brush, you can always take the excess off with tissue, which is something that you always need to have right next to you when you're using watercolors. Then with the same color of the flower, I like to add slightly thicker consistency to add a second layer and also fill in the empty spaces to even out the overall shape. And for the last filler flower, I'm going to use one mixture only with the dominant color being sepia, but since that's what I had on my palette already, I just took the mixture that I already had, and I'm starting with the crooked stems, which is quite easy to achieve using the dry brush. Then I just add tiny ovals along each side to create those buds. Let's begin to paint. I'm going to first start with the main flowers so I can base the composition around these flowers. Before putting it down on the paper, you can also try out your brush load on a scrap piece of paper to make sure it's the right load and consistency that you're looking for. Doing this, I think, also takes the edge off painting a completely empty piece of paper, so try to do it as much as you can to warm up your hands and create those movements with your brush. You can paint these flowers larger than what I'm painting here. Looking at this, I actually prefer it if they were a bit larger, but I like to basically start with the petals only. And notice that I always leave out the center empty so there's space to paint on the stamen without making the flowers look too bulky. Because if all of the shapes are combined really close together without any negative space, it has the feeling of heaviness and it just doesn't look as delicate. Sometimes I like to vary the thickness of the petals, so like the first one, you can see I added just one line for the petal for a bit of variation to the painting. You can also paint these flowers from the back or the side, so none of the center is showing, but you can see a little bit more of the connection between the flower and the stem. After I have a few of the main flowers scattered around the paper, I made the yellow mixture and I painted the yellow flowers around these larger ones. The sides here look a bit too similar between the two, which is why I would recommend for you to draw the main flowers a bit larger than what I did here. So there's more of a size differentiation between the main flowers and the filler flowers. You can also try this out on a scrap piece of paper first to find the scale that you like. Next here, I'm getting ready to paint the stamens and also the stems, so I activated the green and also sepia. I decided to add a little bit of the terre verde to the sepia and use the thick consistency of the sepia to paint the stamens using yet again the dry brush load to create very fine dots and lines with the dry tip of my brush. Notice that as I paint the stamens, there is still a fair bit of white negative space around the center of the flower, and this is what makes the painting look more airy and light because there is still space in between those features for your eyes to rest instead of each flower being overcrowded into a bulky silhouette. For the stems, I used the terre verde with a bit of burnt sienna left on my palette, and I just painted the stems both for the main flowers and the filler flowers together. I differentiate the two by making the stems a bit thinner for the smaller flowers and a bit thicker for the larger main flowers. Where the flowers connected to the stems, I added some lines bunching together to create something like a triangular shape before connecting it to the stems. And for these, I still use the dry brush in order to still include negative space, even in a very small area to create more detail. To paint the leaves, I still use the dry brush technique to keep the texture more cohesive, but there is no rule to this. You can always mix the textures, so you can use a heavier load if you find that a bit more comfortable to paint. I just basically placed the leaves in areas where there's still a bit of space and varying the clusters and also the size of the leaves to suit the available space. Next, I'll be painting the fluffy filler flowers, and for this you can tell that I was being a bit too clumsy with my brush load and consistency, so it turned out a little bit darker than I anticipated, but while the paint is still wet, I could also dab off the excess paint with tissue to make them lighter again. Once I have the main clusters ready, I then added the stems using a lighter consistency sepia on a dry brush again to make sure that those stems are very thin, especially near the clusters at the top. And don't worry too much about creating connecting lines. In fact, I like to break the lines slightly to make it look more delicate and even to give depth, or suggesting that there are parts of the stem sticking through behind those tiny flowers. To finish this filler flower, I added more of the flower mixture to fix the placement if there are any empty spots left, or if some parts look a bit too empty, and I also used this opportunity to add a bit more depth for those small flower clusters. And lastly, I added those woody flower stems and buds in the empty spaces left in the painting, and also just to balance out the color by introducing the darker brown. I think that this painting is a good exercise for brush load control, and you can really take advantage of creating those very fine lines even if you are using a medium or a large size brush. But if you're new to watercolors and you would like to have more control, you can always use a smaller brush to paint the fine stems using still the dry brush technique, which is a bit easier in terms of controlling the brush pressure. Before I leave, I'd like to announce my latest Skillshare class. This class is part of a request to paint the owl from one of my old sketchbook tours. I decided to divide the class into two parts. This first part, where I'll be publishing, will just be the basics of the facial features and proportions in a pencil drawing and an ink pen doodle in case you would like to participate in Inktober next month. Whereas part 2, which will be coming in the next 2 weeks, will be a loose painting of the great horned owl. It is a different take from my old sketchbook painting, but I applied similar techniques to capture the loose textures of the owl. If you're not a member yet, you can also go to the description box to get a free 2 months membership and access to all the Skillshare classes. Anyway, getting back to the finished flower painting, feel free to create your own compositions with these floral elements. Like usual, all of the tools and links to my social media will be available in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!